Untangling the web of factors behind the rise of populism and the kind of culture war divisions cropping up in countries around the world today is no small task. It's an even bigger job when the thesis of the project requires you to confront what many do not want to talk about at all: white identity. Eric Kaufmann's book is called Whiteshift: Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. He is Professor of Politics at the University of London, UK's Birkbeck College, and he joins us now for more. Nice to have you on this side of the pond.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Well, since you've written a book about race, can we start by talking about yours? What are you?
Very mixed, I guess, is the answer to that. I mean, I'm a quarter Chinese, a quarter Hispanic from Costa Rica, and a half Central European Jewish in ancestry. So it's all over the place.
Would you describe yourself as white?
Yes, simply because that's how other people take me, and it's broadly, therefore, how I take myself. But I also would see myself as all those other components.
We are going to have what for many will be a very uncomfortable conversation. Well, let me rephrase. I think the conversation will be comfortable. The topic is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. So let's start, because you start the book by saying that talking about the future of race makes us uncomfortable. It's like talking about sex in Victorian Britain. What makes this so uncomfortable for so many?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there has been a toxicity that's grown up around whiteness because of the associations with things that were bad that happened in the past, and those are real, you know, slavery, Jim Crow, oppressing Native peoples, etc. So I think this identity has a lot of baggage with it, to put it bluntly.
Here's a quote from the book. You write, "If politics in the West is ever to return to normal, rather than becoming even more polarized, white interests will need to be discussed. I realize this is very controversial for left modernists. Yet not only is white group self-interest legitimate, but I maintain that in an era of unprecedented white demographic decline, it is absolutely vital for it to have a democratic outlet. Marginalizing race puritanism is important, but muzzling relaxed versions of white identity sublimates it in a host of negative ways." Let's get into that. What are some of the more negative consequences that you have seen that have resulted from not addressing this?
Well, I think, oddly enough, anti-Muslim prejudice is, we can look at that as an outcome of terrorist events, etc., but it's also the case that it's more acceptable to talk about Islam as a threat to the civic nation than it is to talk about slowing down the rate of ethnocultural change in a country. That's closer to kind of white racism supremacy, whereas if you talk about Islam as a threat to gender roles, Jews, gays, etc., that is an acceptable liberal rationale. So I think I would argue that Islamophobia is where a lot of this sentiment has gone, and is in many ways much more counterproductive. We could also look at, I mean, even Brexit is in some ways a sublimation of concerns over immigration into EU bashing. It's not to say there wasn't anti-EU sentiment, but it wasn't really until that was yoked to the train of anti-immigration sentiment that this movement really got going.
Let me follow up on the Brexit and, of course, the Trump angle on this as well, because I think most people used to say the strongest demographic predictor for the decision to vote either for Trump or for Brexit was where do you live, how much money do you make? You're not on side with that, eh?
No, I mean, you can look at the Trump vote. I mean, even if you just take white Americans, income has absolutely no predictive power on whether you voted for Trump or not. So it's certainly not the losers of modernization, the left behind. Now, in Britain, there is a small effect. Poorer people were somewhat more likely to vote Leave. But by and large, it is cultural indicators and psychological dispositions that give us the best predictive power. So support for the death penalty is a much stronger predictor for whether you voted Leave than how much money you earn.
What else do the Trump and Brexit supporters have in common?
Well, immigration is the central issue in both cases. I mean, in the case of Brexit, 90% roughly of Brexit voters want less immigration. For 40% of them, and this is especially important, immigration was their number one issue. So it's not just that they're opposed, but that's their number one priority. And now in the United States, amongst Trump voters, similarly, 40% of Trump voters say immigration is the number one issue facing the U.S. So in both cases, this was key. And actually, if you look at the people who switched, who were former Obama voters or non-voters, views on immigration were absolutely central in explaining why they moved over to Trump.
This may not be the case in the United States because many people voted for Trump because they thought his prescription for the economy was better than Hillary Clinton's. But I think it is fair to say that it looks like people voted, those who did vote Brexit did so regardless of adverse economic impacts that they expect down the road. Is that right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a significant share of the Brexit voters who are willing to take economic pain. In surveys I've done, to sacrifice up to 5% of their income in order to cut off all immigration from the European Union, for example. So there is a willingness to take economic pain for the Brexit voters, yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
It does make sense in the sense that if you consider that sort of identity factors are driving the motivations of Brexit voters as opposed to personal economic circumstance, then in that sense, it's rational for them to pursue this. So even though from a strictly dollars and cents point of view, it wouldn't make any sense, if you take the full range of their preferences and priorities, which include the cultural ones, then it's probably makes a lot of sense from that worldview.
Do you know why that is? Because I suspect if you ask most Canadians, what worries you more? Or let me put it this way. Would you rather double your income, or are you more concerned that a family of color would move next door to you?
Right.
I think most people rather have the double income as opposed to worrying about who lives next door.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true for most people, but it also depends on what scale we're talking about. If it's a large-scale change in neighborhood, and don't forget, a lot of people's, they don't see that kind of upside, doubling of income. It's maybe a few percentage points on GDP, which they may or may not experience. So they're not, yes, maybe if you told them you've got $1 million, then yes, they wouldn't stick to that position. But given the sort of the sums involved, I think they made that calculation.
What is the religion of anti-racism, as you describe it?
Okay, so part of the book is about this idea of the left and how it's evolved post-1960s in a more culturalist direction. That is, the issues that the left prioritizes are less about class and more about race, sex, gender. And that's fine because those issues did need to be addressed. But it's one thing to say there's discrimination against blacks on the basis of race, and then to move from that to saying society is systemically racist, and by the way, if you say America is a colorblind society, you are engaging in racism. You see that the move is from a sort of something you can measure and define as a violation of equal treatment to something that says something which we would never have thought of as racist actually is racist. It's like saying U.S. is a colorblind society. That move towards, I guess, a sort of more, I think is religious because it's sort of seeing things as racist which most people wouldn't see as racist, and defining especially conservatism as racism. And that's sort of part of the problem, is that expanded definition of racism, which has come to include, say, something like nationalism, something like reducing immigration or making it slower. What that does is it then gets the backup of conservatives who say, well, I'm not a racist, I just want less change and I want people to be assimilated. And that sets this spiral of polarization in motion. So particularly with the rise of the populist right, I use the analogy of a bootlegger, where if the mainstream parties or mainstream liquor outlets are not allowed to operate in this issue, so mainstream stores aren't allowed to supply liquor, then a bootlegger is going to pop up that supplies it. And similarly, if mainstream political parties aren't allowed to sort of advance a platform of reducing immigration because they'll be accused of racism, whether internally or by the media, etc., then the bootlegger is going to pop up and provide the good which is not provided by the mainstream parties, and that's the populist.
Did it seem to you, though, in the last, let's say, 4 decades of the 20th century, that there was pretty decent buy-in to the notion of a multicultural society where we all need to get along?
Well, there is buy-in. There are different gradations there. It depends what we mean by multiculturalism. If it's tolerating people of different backgrounds, appreciating their cultures, that's one thing. I think when it's, as the demographics move, and that's a lot of what the book is about, is in a period where the white share begins to drop, and it then immigration becomes sort of a lightning rod, a symbolic issue that the majority looks at and thinks, okay, it drives home the idea that they're no longer, setting the tone in the society. It's not the country they knew, etc. What multiculturalism tends to then be about, if multiculturalism is about more diversity is always better, multiculturalism is defined against the bad old oppressive past, which is monocultural. So this is a sort of dichotomy. History is moving, progressing inevitably towards multiculturalism. You've got to be on board, and you have to maximize that. So it's that sort of, that's where I'm arguing that this is a sort of more religious, teleological sort of, assuming that history has a certain direction. And if you're in the way of that, if you contest that, then you are, if not a racist, at least a reactionary in some way.
Well, some pretty heavy hitters have said that multiculturalism is, well, where have I got it here? Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, said it has utterly failed multiculturalism. There's plenty of Eastern European leaders who are obviously happy to agree with that. Right. Do you think the multicultural consensus, so to speak, is over?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, you start to see this. I mean, there's a big difference between Merkel and those East European leaders.
Sure.
But I think that starting in the late 90s with the rise of the National Front in France and the Freedom Party in Austria, you start to get center-right figures, Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, moving into this sort of civic nationalism, which says we have to emphasize what we have in common, not emphasize differences. And that's sort of where Merkel and all those European leaders were in 2010. So yeah, starting in the 90s, in Britain you can date it very precisely to something called the Parekh Report in 2000. And then you had some riots between Muslim youths and white British youths in 2001, and then a series of Islamist terrorist attacks sort of 2004 onwards. So that really soured the mood against this idea of celebrating diversity and that our national identity is essentially about diversity. So that whole narrative, I think, got derailed in the sort of early 2000s.
And yet here you are, sitting in a studio in the middle of the capital city of the province of Ontario, where the majority of people were not born in this country, and where multiculturalism, I think most folks think, kind of works. Why is Canada seemingly the exception to all this?
Right, right. So urban areas, including London, by the way, are very, very ethnically mixed, and also the mayor's office has a sort of multicultural idea of London. So it does exist in the diverse cities. It's more controversial, I think, when it's applied to a country. I don't think Canada's the exception. It's English Canada, and we may see that in one of the charts, that in Quebec we can already see a very European pattern taking root, both in terms of attitudes to immigration and the way cultural politics has become important.
Well, you know what, since you've raised it, we may as well show this right now.
Right,
Sheldon,
okay.
you want to bring this graph up?
Okay.
Here is, the surveys. This is a world values survey in red, which are the bars on the left. And then Ipsos Mori did a survey in 2017, which are the darker bars on the right. And, for those of you listening on podcast, I will try to describe this. The French-Canadian / Quebec opposition to immigration is a majority. It is much more significant than in English Canada, where it is a minority. In America, it appears to be a majority. And in Australia, it appears to be a minority or just around the 50% mark. How do you want us to understand the difference between French Canada and English Canada on this?
Well, I think what's important, first of all, is the differences, say, in terms of public attitudes, can all be seen between English Canada and French Canada. So there's nothing about the Canadian state or its model that is doing the work here. I mean, I think one of the differences is that in Quebec, you have an established French-Canadian collective memory, which is linked to a myth of ancestry that is in Quebec. And that's a powerful symbolic resource, and also a cultural tradition which they want to conserve, whereas the English-Canadian cultural tradition, which was sort of a Britannic loyalism or Britannic nationalism, was destroyed with the decline of the British Empire.
The Prime Minister says we have no core identity.
Right, right. So into that vacuum of the end of loyalism comes multiculturalism, this sort of 1960s-derived progressive ideology, which has roots, by the way, in the U.S. in the sort of 1915 to 1920 period, when there was a lot of immigration into the eastern U.S. So when Trudeau says Canada has no core culture, he's sort of exemplifying, this ideology which says that we want to move away from monoculturalism towards multiculturalism. And part of that is to say there's no core culture that people have to assimilate to. Rather, everybody is going to have their own tradition, their own culture. Yes, they're going to interact in public and in politics and the economy and so on, but identity will remain largely at that sort of multipolar level.
But that's not the case in Quebec.
No, in Quebec there is a clear ethnic majority with an attachment to its tradition that is interested in propagating that tradition. In English Canada, that tradition was destroyed. Now, that doesn't mean that populism cannot take root in English Canada. It just means it'll have a harder time, because not only is there not a tradition to conserve as clearly, but secondly, this sort of 1960s progressive culture of anti-racism, multiculturalism, political correctness, and an expanded definition of racism has entrenched itself so heavily in the institutions that it's a much stronger force. But again, that does not mean that populism cannot emerge, because we've seen it in Sweden and Germany, which had the same.
You've anticipated my next question, which is, I think when you were sitting down to write this book some months ago, you thought that there didn't seem to be places in English Canadian society where anti-immigrant sentiment could grow. But that may now have changed?
I think it's changed somewhat. I mean, I always knew that anti-immigration sentiment was there in English Canada, because even in those figures where English Canada is more tolerant, it's still 40% or more saying less immigration. And this is partly because attitudes to immigration are also rooted in these psychological dispositions. Do you like diversity and change, or do you prefer stability and more homogeneity? And that's between a third and a half inherited. It's Karen Stenner's a social psychologist that tells us that. So when we're talking about English Canada, yes, it's the case that the conditions are not as good. But what's really interesting now, and what we've seen, is that it used to be the case, people said Germany, because of its Nazi past, would never have the populist right. Britain, because of its first past the post, would never have the populist right. Spain, because of Franco. Now Spain has got Vox, which is a populist right party. And I think that English Canada, too, will have this. And part of the reason is because, I mean, there's high immigration, there's multiculturalism. I mean, in many ways, Trudeau is a polarizing figure that is going to help this kind of debate. You know, the populist parties move. But the question is really going to be how that fits into federal politics and whether there's space. Because the other thing is, it's not only about cultural traditions, it's also about what's the country I knew growing up? How has my area changed? So you don't actually need a cultural memory going back generations for that to be a driver of populism. So even in English Canada, people who remember a time when the country was more homogenous, that on its own will be enough to actually drive support for this kind of politics.
We have another chart, because on this program we have charts for everything. Here is, Sheldon, you want to bring this up? Graph number 2. Here's how liberals and conservatives see the country very differently. And again, I'll try and describe this for those listening on podcast. If you like the CBC, you tend to be a liberal. If you're a conservative, you tend not to like the CBC. The notion of having a diverse mix of people in the country, again, if you're a liberal, you like it. If you're a conservative, the support numbers are much lower. Margaret Atwood, she's a polarizing figure. If you're liberal, you like Margaret Atwood. If you're a conservative, not at all. First Nations, liberals seem to like more than conservatives do. How about resource towns? Now we go the other way. Conservatives seem to like resource towns more than liberals do. Liberals like Medicare more than conservatives do. And I'm delighted to say liberals and conservatives love hockey equally. That is the one thing upon which this country can unify, hockey. What do these responses tell you about the Canadian identity?
Right. So, I mean, this isn't a huge sample, but essentially what it tells me is a couple of things. First of all, and the question was really about how Canadian do these symbols make you feel? So it's not I specified not to say how much do you like this, in the survey. So this is presumably how much these symbols are making up people's national identity. So what we see is that there is no single Canadian identity. There are two competing identities, and depending on ideology is one dimension in which this polarizes. So for example, the diverse mix of people, that is a sort of key symbol of multiculturalism. That's a very important thing for liberals' Canadian identity.
We should say these were white Canadians.
White Canadians, absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't think the results
survey
would differ much even if you didn't restrict it to whites. But what's also interesting is conservatives don't seem to have a clear set of symbols that make up their Canadianism. They know what they're against, the CBC. They're less keen on diversity. They don't really know. Yeah, they don't really have symbols that they are for that liberals are against. So Don Cherry, both liberals and conservatives like Don Cherry. So there aren't symbols that conservatives can move to distinguish themselves. Whereas in the United States, I ran a similar survey, and there are very clear conservative symbols like pickup trucks and cowboys,
yes,
which divide liberals and conservatives.
Let's do another quote from the book here, because you asked the question, what's a white minority to do? Let's find out what that path looks like. I chart, you write, the 4 main white responses to ethnic change. fight, repress, flee, and join. Whites can fight ethnic change by voting for right-wing populists or committing terrorist acts. They may repress anxieties in the name of politically correct anti-racism, but cracks in this moral edifice are appearing. Many opt to flee by avoiding diverse neighborhoods, schools, and social networks, and other whites may choose to join the newcomers, first in friendship and subsequently in marriage. The title of your book is Whiteshift, and that's what we're going to talk about now. What is the Whiteshift and how would it work?
Right, so essentially Whiteshift has two meanings. One is sort of the next few decades, which is this idea of the declining white majorities across the West and the sort of populist politics and polarization that seems to be associated with. Longer term, though, Whiteshift really is going to be about a large-scale racial mixing, which is going to result in this mixed-race majority. So in Britain, for example...
Say that again. Mixed-race majority.
Exactly. So in Britain, for example, which is perhaps a little bit behind Canada in this, the proportion of mixed race is only about 2% now. It's slated to go to only about 7% by mid-century. But then it starts to sort of move up in a sort of logarithmic curve. So we get to about almost 30% mixed by the end of the century, and very quickly 75% 50 years later. So it's further out, but it's almost mathematically inevitable given the rates of interracial marriage we see across Western countries. So that's the sort of long-term white shift, which is the white group absorbing people of many different backgrounds. But what I argue in the book, particularly for Europe, is that this mixed population will trace its primary ancestry and cultural antecedents back to the European traditions, simply because those will be more distinct in the world of 2050, for example, where whites are going to be a very, very small share of the globe's population.
Now, this is fascinating because I think it's fair to say 50 years ago, in this city in particular, but in the country in general, if you were Italian, the white majority didn't necessarily think you were part of them, or Portuguese, or certainly not Jewish. But nowadays, all those groups are considered white. So you are fast forwarding us, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, to a point where even people we consider brown today are going to be considered part of the white majority then?
Right, if there are certain cultural cues, sort of this, I'm arguing that it could be about first name, it could be about dress or some sort of cultural style. But essentially there are two meanings of the term white. The first is sort of racial, which is a piece of the physical spectrum that, isn't, I think, going to change that much. It's fuzzy at the edges. The second is it's a proper name for the ethnic majority, the group that, shares common ancestry or believes itself to be of shared common ancestry. And it's that second meaning, essentially I don't think that what we call white in kind of racial phenotypical terms is going to change much. But the ethnic majority group will expand beyond the boundaries of that racial whiteness to include people who you wouldn't know are white.
Well, I was going to say, like 50 years ago, no disrespect intended, a guy with your Asian and Jewish background would not be considered white in this city.
Right.
But now you are.
Well, but again, I think people have taken this too far. So in the United States, it's often claimed that, right, that Jews or Italians weren't white. They weren't part of the WASP ethnic majority, but they were still considered white, and white under the law, and there's a number of studies have shown this. So
they weren't as white as the white Anglo-Saxon
Protestants.
No,
they weren't. But that's a sort of intra-white, within the racial group exclusion. I try and distinguish between the racial and the ethnic was narrower than the racial, and I think it's going to become broader than the racial.
Well, you will not be surprised to hear that what you have just advanced is causing a lot of angst among some. There was a Turkish political scientist whose name I can't pronounce. I'm going to try it, actually. Umut Özkirimli?
Right.
Am I close?
Yes.
He called you part of the, quote, academic alt-right, said your work provides illiberal, anti-immigrant sentiments with a veneer of respectability. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, he had almost no backing amongst any academics, so that's number one. But the other thing is, what's interesting about this is the actual alt-right, like the Daily Stormer and these places have been attacking me relentlessly, in videos with tens of thousands of members, because I'm essentially saying that whites are going to melt into this multiracial majority. So I'm kind of getting attacked from the real alt-right, and I'm sort of getting attacked from the far left. Now, I know Umut, I mean, he's a great guy, and I have respect for him, but I mean, I think he's sort of really going off the deep end here and doesn't have a lot of support, even within the academic left, who have actually criticized, members of whom have criticized him for this. So I'm not too worried about that.
Let's say that the issues that you raise in the book are not addressed adequately in the way that you would like to see them. Dissent is stifled. There is no opportunity to discuss these things and so on. Over the next 50 years, how do you see us rolling out?
Well, I think that will lead to polarization. And so I think...
Worse than now? Seems pretty bad now.
It will, yes, I think it could get bad. It could get worse. I think the U.S. is where you see that sort of stifling going on within the Democratic Party, which is actually, I think, worsening polarization. Now, the Republicans are off the deep end too, but I think we have to get to a position where, I say in the book, we can discuss immigration rates as calmly and rationally as tax rates. And with tax rates, you know, yes, you might want more, you might want less. The people who want less, you don't simply demonize as the worst people on earth, and vice versa. So I think we need to get to a position where we can have that calm discussion, and then people will say, I wanted a lot less, but they want more, so we've met in the middle, and I can accept that. You know, I think that is the way to kind of diffuse some of this. It's never going to be, no one's ever going to get exactly what they want. And actually, the European mainstream parties are adapting, I would say. I mean, the left-wing parties in many countries are saying, yes, we have to talk about this issue. We have to sort of accommodate this to some degree, and that's fine. I think that is a healthy way to proceed when you actually throw a wrench into the works and say, no, this is off the table. We can't have a democratic discussion. I think you build up pressure, and it gets expressed and sublimated in ways we can't predict. I mean, Brexit is one example of that.
Well, Brexit's one example, but at least it was a Democratic vote. Are you anticipating more white terrorism going forward?
I don't. I'm very against scaremongering and manipulating of fear. So, and I tend to believe in the sort of Steven Pinker argument that we are moving towards a less violent society. I think you will just get polarization. So in the U.S., the Democrats may win elections, but the Senate may be, because it's based on a territorial principle, which is, you know, whites tend to be more spread across the United States. The Senate will go Republican in the governor's mansions, and you'll get this sort of standoff between rural or the whiter parts of America and the federal government. And that's just going to be an unhealthy state of affairs. You would rather have a situation where where people can find compromise and work to solve problems in a rational way.
Sure, that's what everybody wants,
Right,
but the fact is that I mean, they call it a Balkanization for a reason, and it was only 25 years ago the Balkans exploded. Can you imagine that happening in the United States?
I mean, it's obviously anything's possible, and I know some people are predicting civil war in the U.S. I'm more skeptical of these claims. I just don't think you may get some terrorism. You may get a slight uptick in far-right terrorism. I'm reluctant to say there's going to be civil war, although I know there are people who argue that.
Does war, in a weird way, bring people together? It does have a clarifying effect. It's awful, but it can have a clarifying effect, right?
Right, it absolutely does. So if the U.S. was invaded, then their polarization would be gone. And there are even experiments that show when you talk about an alien invasion of Earth, have people read that paragraph, then a lot of their attitudes shift on these matters and become more conciliatory. So yeah, there's no question, and we've seen it in history in the U.S. You know, the Second World War really kind of ended anti-Semitism in a very large way, which was actually quite strong in the 20s and 30s. And similarly, the Civil War kind of took away a lot of the anti-Irish prejudice that was there in the 1850s. So
we got about a minute to go here, Eric, so let me ask you one thing. The time has just flown
it
by,
does,
hasn't
yeah,
it?
it does.
You entertain the idea that as the West becomes more diverse, some white people, in reaction, could retreat and try to kind of recreate a 1950s Eisenhower-style Leave It to Beaver America. What would that look like today? Could you do that today?
Well, this was in the context of virtual reality and these sorts of ideas, which I think are, I mean, I say in the book, I think that's science fiction and this is never going to happen, but it was more a playful way of exploring the idea of exit and flee and how that might manifest itself in a sort of uber tech age.
Were you being playful as well when you thought half of America is going to be Amish in 50 years?
Well, no, I don't think that's playful. I mean,
200 years, sorry.
Right, 200. So it's a little over 200 years. I don't know if, essentially these groups, and this is what I wrote about in my previous book, ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Amish, Hutterites, etc., to some extent, the Mormons, they are sort of defying the modern trend towards lower fertility. And the Amish double every 25 years. They've done that for a century or more. If they do that for another 2 centuries, yes, there will be 300 million Amish in America.
A fascinating book and well worth the conversation. I want to thank you for coming in tonight and sharing your views on this. That's Eric Kaufmann, Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.